Hello and welcome to episode 22 of Mjolnir the Movies. With me, as ever, are James and Neil. Hello to you two.
Hello.
Hello.
And I'm David Yorkshire, editor of Mjolnir magazine. Welcome back. Now, this week we're going to be looking at two films. Birth of a Nation, which is extremely controversial and still, though, the biggest selling silent film of all time. And less controversial, but still quite controversial, is Gone with the Wind, which is still the biggest grossing film of all time when adjusted for inflation. So this is how big these two films are, and yet very controversial films, as I've said. Now, Birth of the Nation has been in the news quite recently, hasn't it, James? You've been following this story.
There was a campus cinema has had to be renamed. It was named after Lillian
Gish.
That's right. Apparently, somebody suddenly complained, and a cinema that's been named this way for some decades has to be renamed. They've not decided on the name, but once again, it's going to reflect modern ideas and attitudes, the new name allegedly.
Yeah, that's right. This is at Bowling Green University, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's
I find
Bowling
it very
Green
hard.
State University or something like that. It's the cinema department, isn't it?
Yeah. I find it very hard to believe that somebody was a silent film enthusiast and immediately recognised this actress's name. And I mean, it's not the only thing she's ever done in her life, but because her name is attached to this film because she once acted in it, it's now beyond the pale and has to be torn down. It's so absurd. I doubt very much that a silent film enthusiast would have objected to her name anyway.
No, that's right. And in fact, she did a hell of a lot for the preservation of silent films as well. And she also did a lot to progress ideas on acting and so on in films.
Probably why her name's up there, not one of the many other ones.
That's right. And she did many different films. She was in Night of the Hunter as well, very famously, one of my favourite films.
That's a great movie.
Yeah, it is.
These people are just actors and actresses. I mean,
well,
now, whatever the politics might have been, I'll let you go into that. But these people react to them as if what they're on the screen is what they are. As if a character who plays a rapist is a rapist, you know? Like James McAvoy must have a split personality and kidnap girls out of car parks. He doesn't, don't sue me. It's a reference
You
to
might,
Split.
Yeah, the problem with Lillian Gish as well was that she was a Republican, big supporter of Ronald Reagan. Before that, she was a member of the America First Committee, a very active member in the America First Committee, which, of course, wanted to keep America out of the Second World War. She claimed that she was actually blacklisted by the film and theatre industries after that, you know, that when she joined the America First Committee, which had certain fascist, shall we say, sympathies and was against philo-Semitism, and she, you know, she was blacklisted by the film and cinema industry after that, although she did still get parts, as we know.
Funny that for all the outcry about the blacklist for actors and actresses, you don't hear much about her suffering, or they don't seem to have much sympathy for her now.
No, that's right. They always talk about the episode with the Communist Party members who were allegedly persecuted, especially, you know, with the trials by Senator Joe McCarthy. That's right. Yeah, Senator Joe McCarthy. That's right. Yeah, we hear about that all the time, but we don't hear the other end of things. We don't hear about people being blacklisted for rightist ideas and so on.
Which just shows you who controls it in the end. Who controls the media that tells you about it.
Yeah. But we have, at the moment, a lot of things happening like this. You know, anyone with any even remotely conservative ideas being blacklisted. James Woods, for example. When was the last time you heard of James Woods?
Well, the only time you heard about him recently was when he was banned off Twitter.
Exactly. Yeah. So this shows, and these ideas, you know, that he's going on about, they're pretty milquetoast, actually. The traditional Republican ideas. I mean, if he was espousing Democrat ideas from before the turn of the century, you know, now they would have been radical ideas, but we'll come on to that because that's part of the film, actually.
Yep. I think James Woods is in more episodes of Family Guy than anything else.
Is he?
Yeah, I think that's only the reason I've really kind of remembered him is from Family Guy.
Videodrome.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, we did Videodrome just a little while ago.
Mm.
There's also Tim Allen as well. I know that he's had a lot of trouble, and they threatened to cancel his show from ABC, didn't they?
Oh,
That's right, yeah.
Because he espoused conservative and really, as I say, milquetoast conservative ideas.
but you know how it goes, where they're now portraying classic liberals as far right extremists, because that's the trick in how they move the window. They'll proclaim somebody who was actually in the middle as the right and move the window over to the left and say, well, and they'll say, oh, I'm a centrist, and yet you hear what they list they believe in, and it's actually, you know, all very far left beliefs.
That's right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's just, one or two dissident ideas and really mild dissident ideas as well. They'll not tackle something like race or racial inequality, biological racial inequality and things like that, or inequalities within the sexes. Even that's a bit dubious. They might go for that because it's not as big as the racial question, to be quite honest. But as soon as you touch anything like race, you're in trouble.
No, you'll never get on TV talking about that.
It's interesting, though, that the feminist lobby have said nothing about Lillian Gish's name being taken down. This is someone who worked within the film industry and had a very big impact on the film industry and a strong female character, but yet nothing has been said by the feminist lobby.
The progressive stack at work.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, the next big thing is transgender, and so the old-fashioned kind of feminism goes out the window and gets replaced by something even more retarded.
And that's the trouble when you open the door to something. If you've not got a good reason to close the door, then you're stuffed, and they don't. They've opened it in a way they have no argument that can't be used against them to keep it open and open it further.
Yeah, that's right. But I think that one of the reasons why Lillian Gish's name has been taken away from the cinematic department at Bowling Green State University is really because they can't do away with the film Birth of a Nation itself. They can't throw it down the memory hole because it had too big an impact on cinema in general. Now, this is really groundbreaking. I know it sort of, to people looking at it now, it doesn't look so groundbreaking, but it absolutely is. Nothing remotely had been attempted like this film before, had it?
Feels like when you're watching it, you could almost forget it's a silent film apart from the obvious. The style of the shots, the way they set up the framing, the way they structure the story, it's all very familiar to a modern audience because this is where these ideas were being invented.
Absolutely. And there's a comparison between Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind in the structure and setup of the two films, because you have it in two parts, both films, don't you? Now, there are reasons for that. One is, of course, and it's been forgotten now, but when I was a kid, in many films, you had an interval in the film.
Well, they include that on most versions of Gone with the Wind now. They include all the original title cards and interval music and so on, which is quite cool to bring that experience back.
I just sit through the version I watched. I watched it for the first time just recently, and there was a 5-minute overture at the start, and there's like a screen card that you could imagine being on a cinema screen way back, and people getting in their seats and getting comfortable. And halfway through, there's another 5-minute like intermission break, and there's some music playing in the background, and you can imagine people getting off their seats and going to the toilet and coming back, and just in time for the start of the second half of the movie. It's fantastic. Really nostalgic.
Absolutely, yeah. The interval, at least in Birth of a Nation, it serves another purpose, a purpose as narrative as well, doesn't it? I don't know if you noticed that, because it separates things into antebellum and postbellum.
Yeah.
In other words, the war, before the war, and the war itself, and then in the second part we have the Reconstruction period.
Similar, of course, to Gone with the Wind. It followed the same format, really.
Yeah, although in Gone with the Wind, it's true, there's the war, and that's sort of in the middle. The war carries on a little bit after the interval, though. But not, you're right, it's not much after that it stops, but you do get a little bit of residue, if you like.
Mm.
The main separation is really the return to Tara, because one of the big differences that I noticed between the two films is that Gone with the Wind is more personal than Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is really about the war and the politics of the war and the politics of Reconstruction. But Gone with the Wind gets really down to the more personal level. That's probably as well to do with the source material, because the source material of Birth of a Nation is Thomas Dixon's novel, The Klansman, whereas Gone with the Wind was a novel written by Margaret Mitchell. Now, of course, you have a very masculine view of things and a feminine view of things. And the feminine view of things always tends to be more personal and more at a micro level than the masculine view of things, who has more of a global idea of things and looking at things outside and the bigger picture and so on. Whereas Margaret Mitchell is much more about the family and people. Although you do have that in Birth of a Nation. We'll come on to that as well. I don't know what you guys think about this.
Yeah, I would say that the town was almost the main character in Birth of a Nation. You felt it more like it was an ensemble cast, you were watching it. And Gone with the Wind, yeah, it was all about Scarlett's family. And everything else was sort of orbited around her journey.
I think her journeys through, everything that happens to her seems to be tragic. Nothing ever seems to go her way. There's even the scene where, in order to make a dress, she has to take down some curtains. She just has to scrape by. When she scrapes by, it almost seems like it always ends badly for her in some way, but she's still there. So it's a very good film for women, actually. If you want to talk about a film that promotes a strong woman, I would say this is probably the film. None of this Black Widow and Captain Marvel nonsense that's out nowadays. This really is a film for women, I would say.
That's very strong physical and mental endurance to go through all that. They do display her as an absolute brat to start with, so it's quite a shock and a wake-up call to go through.
She's a valuable life lesson near the start, though, where they still have the Earth. And I think deep down she knows that. I'm sure they say that she's part Irish and she'll always will be part Irish. Is that right?
Yeah,
there'll always be Irish inside her, and she'll always have that love for her country, her land, despite whether or not she's a brat or not. And she is. She's a brat through most of the movie, and she's spoiled and she wants it all her own way, but she's still a strong woman. And it's a great story.
That's right. She is indeed. Her father's Irish, her mother's Scottish in the novel by Margaret Mitchell. In fact, the novel is far more complex than the film because she marries 3 times, of course, and she has different children to the husbands. So things are far more complex, but they've been simplified down because the original script was for a film of about 6 hours. This was by Sidney Howard. And so the script got worked on to dilute it down to a bit less than 4 hours. I
read a bit where the 6-hour script, I think they got him back to kind of rework it, and it ended up even longer. He was meant to cut it down, and he ended up making it a wee bit longer again.
Oh, God.
Yeah. He must have really liked the film, though. If you get that kind of passion, you keep rewriting it, then you end up with it longer. You must be really fascinated with the story.
Yeah. But one of the things that you touched upon there, which was the sort of racial aspect in a way, because one of the things in the novel by Margaret Mitchell that doesn't really get touched upon, it does to an extent implicitly in the film, and that's this idea that Scarlett O'Hara is half Irish and half Scottish. Her mother's Scottish, her father, or of Scottish descent, I should say, and her father is Irish. And this leads to a sort of imbalance in her. And this is why she is how she is. Sort of character's quite unpredictable at times. And she goes back to one thing and then another. She can be extremely sensible at times, which is a Scottish side, and then really sort of flighty at other times, which is her Irish side. Because her father very much is that, flighty sort of romantic type of guy, if you see what I mean. But her mother is very focused and very grounded and so on.
I don't know. I think it maybe swap those roles. I think the Scots can be a bit flighty at times too.
Well, as I say, this is Margaret Mitchell's idea, not mine. This is
I suppose, yeah.
what's in the novel.
And of course, these are sort of, especially from outside or international point of view. Back then, there was understood national characters for each group. There was a character for the Swedes, there was a character for the Scots, there was a character for the Irish, the Welsh, the French, everybody, and it was sort of known. Obviously, it didn't stay
nobody
true.
got offended either.
Yeah, nobody got offended by that idea either.
Well, of course, Carlton Coon, in 1939, which is the same year that this film came out, Carlton Coon released his book, The Races of Europe. Not the race of Europe, but the races of Europe. Because there are differences even within the macro group, if you like, of the white Caucasian race. I mean, we'll come on to some of the racial aspects. We might as well have a look at those now. I think that they more or less have the same sort of ideas on race. Well, actually, Birth of a Nation is a little harsher than Gone with the Wind on black people, I think. I think that Birth of a Nation is more realistic. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, there's quite a few black people in Gone with the Wind, but they're nice. They kind of do make them out to be really stupid and like silly and clumsy. But at the same time, there's the maid whose name I forget, who seems to be quite with it. And she's quite caring of the kids and she's looking out for them. And she does seem to have this genuine concern for the family that she's using the maid work for. So that says to me, well, she's obviously not treated badly. They're not making this family out to be evil white people who have a black slave and they whip her into submission. She seems to have quite a close relationship with them, and they seem to like her and respect her.
You have that in Birth of a Nation as well. And in fact, the character is called the same thing, which is Mammy. And this is not really a name as such as an archetype. It's what the plantation owners called the black servant who looked after the kids and so on. She was called Mammy.
Right.
And so you have a Mammy in Birth of a Nation, and you have a Mammy in Gone with the Wind.
Let's look at this historically, because I don't know much about this, just in case anybody's got a question about it. Were they slaves that were chained to the walls and beaten and fed oats and water? Or were they part of the family? Were they part of the household where they had a say in things, although they had a job to do? Were they really slaves, as what we're led to believe in today's modern world?
One distinction that is always made, at least by honest historians, is the difference between the plantation slaves and the house servants,
right?
With black slaves. The house servants were treated much better than the ones in the plantation.
It looks more like the kind of life and relationship a lot of the servant class had in Victorian times in Britain and probably elsewhere. And obviously those people were white.
Absolutely right. And in fact, some of these blacks probably got a lot better treated than the white servants in the big houses, in the stately homes and so on in Britain. So when we're talking about slavery and servitude, indentured servitude and so on, there are degrees and degrees that are not addressed in modern history.
Especially as back then, even if you were a free man, let's say, for a lot of people, freedom to walk out your job was freedom to walk out your job and die in the street or be rounded up for indentured servitude because you were a vagrant, which is the two ends you likely would have. So even if you did get a wage, most of these people were essentially slaves to the company anyway. That's where you get the stories of the company store and the bad mills and so on. There's a lot of that kind of abuse.
Yeah. Lots of kids in Scotland were stolen off the streets and put onto ships and sent over to America just because they were there. And we don't get told about these things. We get told, oh, it's our fault, it's our ancestors' fault. But I say, well, our ancestors were rounded up ourselves, especially Scottish and Irish people. So if anyone's going to talk about slavery, I mean, I can't imagine the Scots and Irish who were sent over there were treated like kings.
No, that's right. Particularly the Irish. The Irish were extremely looked down upon and were treated sometimes much worse than slaves. Equally, in Britain, in the cotton mills and so on, in the north of England, they were also treated far worse than slaves. You would work in a factory from dusk until dawn, never seeing. From dawn until dusk. That's a different film. But anyway, from dawn until dusk, and you would never see daylight. And we're talking about kids. Kids used to have to clean the machines while they were running because you couldn't cut into production time. And of course, they were sometimes mangled up in the machines and everything, and losing arms and so on. And and these people would be whipped and everything by the mill owners. One of the interesting things about the Civil War, the American Civil War, which is never really addressed that much, is the impact it had in the north of England on the cotton industry, because obviously there were no such things as unemployment benefit or something like that. Well, what happened to the cotton industry during the American Civil War? It shut down. And that meant that it led to mass unemployment up in the north of England. Now, there's this guy who he had a fleet of ships. He was a merchant and so an English ship owner called Zachariah Pearson. He's a big philanthropist and lived in Kingston upon Hull. So in Hull, where Mjolnir magazine's base is, and where the National Front's base is as well. We'll get onto that in a little moment. And he sent out his fleet of ships to try to send arms in return for cotton to the Confederate Army. Now, he didn't get through the northern blockade, unfortunately, but there was huge sympathy in the north of England for the Confederate cause, even though, down in the south, in Westminster and so on, they all supported Abraham Lincoln because of the slave trade and so on, and Britain at that time's commitment to ending the slave trade everywhere, and ending not just the slave trade, but slavery everywhere. But in the north, there was much sympathy for the Confederates because of the cotton industry. And as I say, he sent this fleet of ships out, but failed, sadly, and it bankrupted him, actually. But he gave his land to the city of Hull when he died, Zachariah Pearson, basically as a municipal park for the people of Hull. It's called Pearson Park now. Now, interestingly, there's also a Zachariah Pearson pub in Hull. And that is where the National Front used to meet before moving on to, to the place where the meeting used to take place. It was the redirection point. Because, of course, in Britain, if you're of the right and you're in a right-wing party and so on, you need redirection points because the left, the extreme left, Antifa, Hope Not Hate, and all these groups will attack your meeting. So the Zachariah Pearson pub used to be, it's not now, but it used to be the meeting point of the Hull NF. So it's quite interesting how these things come back.
Yeah.
Another thing that mentioned the industry is the fact that it also highlights the delicateness of the sort of globalist system when it comes to mercantile industry. Got all this stuff shipped about, and everybody's reliant in huge areas of a country to the point of almost starving to death, or probably some of them literally, on this trade that can just be snuffed out with a wink or moved to another part of the world by whoever owns it, just moving a transfer of wealth through a bank or something, and that's it. Millions are out of work and starving.
Absolutely. Well, this is the thing, and something that doesn't get addressed much. They talk about the Irish famine quite a lot, and a lot of Irish, of course, came to England to find work. Now, in the north of England, we had the trade unionist movement who were campaigning for higher wages, especially in the mills and so on. And of course, one of the things they tried to do was to go on strike to force the mill owners into increasing wages. But of course, with the Irish coming in, and they were deliberately brought into England to fill the gaps left by strikers, so that the strikes had no effect whatsoever on the cotton industry.
Using one starving mob against another, really.
That's right. And this is the thing. This is how people above us in the elites and so on, they play one group of people against another.
The problem there is you don't turn your hate towards the Irish, but even though they might be you might feel they're the immediate problem in that historical context. The real problem is the bastards that are moving the pieces about on the board, using these groups.
That's right, exactly. I have absolutely nothing against the Irish because they've been treated very badly. But the Irish also need to understand that it was not the British per se who persecuted them. It was the establishment and it was the elites
The
in
guy in the pub,
Westminster.
or the one working down the pit, or the mine, none of those people were sitting plotting to bother the Irish at all.
That's right, yeah.
These people had horrible jobs of their own and a lot of hardships that they were worrying about. They're completely out the loop politically.
Yeah, exactly. So there are some things that get spoken about, with the since Irish nationalism and so on, the potato famine and government attitudes to the potato famine have been talked about. But this in the north of England doesn't get talked about much at all, to be quite honest. And that's really because of a failure of British nationalism.
It causes the problem where people don't realise the sheer scope of contempt that the people at the top have had for a very long time for everybody else. If you just think, obviously what was done to the Irish was disgusting, but what they also did to everybody else was disgusting. If you realise that the scope of the horrendous treatment and behaviour, then you start to realise that the problem is not the mass of this nation or that nation. It's this small group at the top, the elites that control things, the merchants that can move the money. It's not the man in the street that's to blame.
That's right, yeah. So as I say, during the American Civil War, we saw starvation on the streets of places like Manchester and Bradford and so on. These places, these same mill towns that have experienced mass immigration now as the same kind of bourgeois elites, destroy them again. It's, history repeats itself. And they've hammered these places with immigration again to make the poor even poorer again and to exploit the poor again.
Because the trouble is you can never compete for a rising wage. If you've got supply and demand and an infinite supply of labour, then how can you ever get the wage going up, which requires demand to go up?
That's right.
I mean, that's basic economics, yet everybody tries to pretend it no longer works.
Yeah, that's right. So the thing about slavery in America is it has to be put into its context, in that if you were a slave owner, you were responsible for that slave, ideally. Of course, it didn't always work, and some slaves were badly treated. But you would not be looked upon favorably in your community, because we have to remember that these were very Christian communities, Christian in the old sense of the word. In other words, that you had this duty to your fellow man and so on. And although they looked upon the Negro as inferior, they looked upon the Negro as someone you had to take care of. They didn't look upon them probably as fully human as a white person, but still, they would be looked upon as that you had to have a responsibility to them, and that it was a moral duty to that. Now, some people, of course, neglected that moral duty, but it doesn't mean to say that the moral duty never existed.
Obviously, in the north of America, at the same time, they had the same terrible conditions that we saw in Britain for industry. Don't forget that as well. There was the child labour, 8-year-old girls, 8-year-old boys down pits pulling trucks of coal.
Exactly, yeah.
And what happened was exactly the same thing with the Irish into England, or whatever mass of people used and abused against another mass of people. Was with the emancipation, they moved all the blacks into the industry to destroy their unions.
Exactly right, yeah. So people are being used, the little people, they're being pushed against each other all the time. Unfortunately, it always tends to be the bourgeois class. Now, the bourgeois class in this American Civil War are basically the winners. You don't just have a system, it's not just a war. It's a war of ideas, basically, between the same stock of people, ultimately.
Which is important for folk to remember when they try to blame everything for all history on the other and try and pretend there's nothing wrong on their own side.
Exactly right, yeah. Because there's been a problem with the bourgeois industrial class for a long, long time, and with its ideas of simultaneous exploitation and simultaneous guilt. It's bizarre, but yet this is how they are, and they have this double thinking and have had it for a long, long time, which comes from a Protestant theological background, I'm going to be doing a few videos on this anyway. But in any case, what you have in the South is very much an agrarian way of life. It's sort of a replacement for the old aristocratic way of life back in Europe. But even this is not a great way of doing things, because what they've done is they've replaced the white peasant class with black slaves. So I would even criticize this.
It should have been, they should have tidied their own houses and picked their own cotton, as they say.
That's right. Well, of course, during this time, you've got white sharecroppers who are struggling to make a living. And as I say, you had to feed and water the slaves, the black slaves and everything, and keep them from dying and so on. But there was no such compunction for white people. They were expected to fend for themselves. And the same, in England and so on. And so if they died, it was their own fault.
They'd set up a situation where there wasn't truly a peasant class, so therefore the aristocrats had no sense of duty towards them either, like they might have done in the old days. They were just, they treated the white people or the blacks as they might have done like farm machinery.
Probably more like, horses or cattle or whatever, something like that. A bit better, but still. Well, perhaps not as good as a horse, to be honest. But still, there was this idea that you had to look after them. The house servants were certainly treated far better than the white working class in Britain, for example. That's a fact. So we have to look at degrees on this, and that is something that's not looked on now. Now, speaking about history and historians and so on, Birth of a Nation is very much based on the school of history known as the Dunning School, which was contemporaneous at the time. This was a group of historians at Columbia University named after Professor William Archibald Dunning and basically his PhD students. And so this is where a lot of these terms that are in Birth of a Nation and even in Gone with the Wind come from. Things like scallywag, which is a Southern collaborator during Reconstruction, in particular Copperhead, which is a Northern sympathizer for the Southern cause. A carpetbagger. Carpetbagger in particular is a real term of abuse, which is basically someone coming from the North to exploit the South after the war. You see this in both films, particularly Gone with the Wind, actually. You see this Negro come down in the carriage with this white guy, and he has the carpet bag resting on his lap. It's literally a bag made from carpet, which is where the name comes from.
Was that like to represent the fact that these so-called poor black people who had been freed from the Civil War were now turning on their old masters and coming back to abuse them?
Well, these are blacks from the North who haven't actually experienced slavery.
All right, so they came down and took advantage anyway.
Yeah. Well, one of the big things, of course, it's not addressed that much in Gone with the Wind, to be honest, but it certainly is in Birth of a Nation, is the disenfranchisement of whites in the South. In other words, they're stopped from voting, whereas blacks are given enfranchisement. We have suffrage for blacks, but suffrage is taken away from whites. Did you notice that scene in the Birth of a Nation where they go to vote?
The ballot stuffing.
That's right. Well, not just the ballot stuffing, but the whites go to vote, and the blacks, of course, are there with the ballot boxes, and they're turning them away. And there's a big sign next to them saying equality. Did you see that? and I couldn't help thinking about how relevant that is to today. That we're all talking about equality and so on, and yet and I know that blacks are more equal than whites in the sight of the bourgeois class that is ruling us.
Of course.
Yep.
We got Oprah Winfrey, highest paid TV chat show of all time, Michael Jackson, Muhammad Ali. I mean, I could go on with a list of black people who are way more famous and affluent than any of us will be. And why are they in this position in America if it's such a racist place to live? What's their excuse? I mean, the racists weren't holding them back. So this lie that the black people in America have somehow suffered as a result of slavery a couple of hundred years ago are completely neglecting the fact that they're actually doing very, very well these days as a result of it.
Yeah, absolutely right. But yet they're still not happy. They're still not satisfied. The fact is that blacks, not just in America, but in Europe as well, and bear in mind that these are our homelands. These are the homelands of white people. And yet they're getting a leg up above and beyond us, being found jobs in the state. They have groups that get them jobs. They have quotas now and so on. The BBC, of course, discriminate openly against white people. And so you have this with the American Civil War. This is probably the first time that this happens. And this is shown in Birth of a Nation and why it's so unpopular. That you have this system for the first time where blacks are more privileged than whites. And it's other whites that have fought for that to happen. Of course, what you have in Birth of a Nation is this radical politician, don't you? Don't know if you noticed this characterization of this black politician who's in there.
Oh.
Stoneman.
That's it. Nope.
Yeah.
There's quite a few sort of archetypes of both good and bad that you can recognise in film later, but obviously this one addresses some red hot topics that you can't touch normally.
That's right. Well, I mean, there is a red hot topic here, and Stoneman is very much like Bill Clinton or someone like that, isn't it? If you notice, he's given this one leg shorter than the other and everything. So you have this critique of disabledism as well, in that this guy, we're imprinting morality on bodies here, whereby because he's physically awkward and physically impaired, he's also somehow mentally impaired and awkward.
Although that became a bit taboo over time, the idea that the connection between body and spirit, you still see that reflected for most of cinematic history with scars and eye patches and whatnot, mostly with villains.
That's right, absolutely right. It's this idea that they are somehow scarred within as well as. So they're imprinting their spirit on the body as well. But equally, I think also you've got this idea that because he's less socially acceptable, shall we say, he's more sympathetic to the other as well, the outsider. If you notice, the left, they've always targeted the outsider and the other in all their forms to bring them together as this allegedly oppressed mass, this disparate group who is united by their common oppression and so on, to use as a battering ram against norms, basically. So you have this Stoneman character, and of course he builds up this half-caste Silas Lynch as being we may laugh at the word Lynch here, actually, being used in, he's got the surname Lynch.
Did he have a mob?
He does indeed, yes, he has a mob. And he has this ambition of becoming king of America and having this black army and so on to take over America. But actually, isn't this just like the ANC in South Africa? If you actually look at what's happening here on the film,
not too far away, is it?
No, it's not at all.
That's one thing that nobody ever speaks about, and sadly on our side, what's happening in South Africa. I'm worried about what some idiot rap star or celebrity in America said on Twitter, and they don't care what's happening to the white people in South Africa who are effectively being cleansed by black people in their thousands, murdered.
That's right.
Daisy-chained.
Yeah, when people on the right talk about white genocide and the people on the left say, oh, this is nonsense, this is just conspiracy theory and shit like that. Absolutely not. This is happening as government policy in South Africa. No one in the mainstream is speaking up about this.
Yeah, nobody. No, literally nobody. You have to really dig for it.
It's
you won't go on BBC and say white family murdered. You'll see something about some evil racist white guy who said something in a YouTube video.
Well, that's it. I mean, we'll get in Britain, we'll get news that somebody said something a bit offensive in America. And you go, well, okay, if that's so important, you've got to bring this news thousands of miles to us. then obviously, one, there can't be very much happening in America. Well, we know that's not true, obviously, but it gives you the impression that the only thing that's happened in America that week is somebody said something rude. 300 million people, only thing that happened was somebody said something rude. But also, if that's so important, why do they ignore literal murders and tortures in another country across the sea? Because
well, they do it, but they do if the people are ethnically of that country. But if it's white people in South Africa, I genuinely think that people shrug their shoulders and say things like, well, they deserved it, didn't they, in the end, because they invaded first. And they'll have some kind of ill logic like that in their mind, which makes it seem not so as important because of what they done to black people a couple of 100 years ago. They've just reversed the roles, basically. But
that's the danger and the end point of the whole white guilt thing. If you can't even justify your own existence, then you can't stop what starts happening in places like South Africa, albeit right now it's still at a low level. But if they can't morally stop the low level, then what's to stop them from just gunning them down? If they decide that they are morally justified, you could end up with something like you saw in the Soviet Union or China during the Maoist period, or other countries when things really went to hell.
Or Venezuela, somewhere like that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how that's going to turn out. Yeah, it could go that way. You don't know.
Well, one of the things in South Africa that people forget is that blacks had a pretty good standard of living. You know, it wasn't just exploitative or something like that. And the ruling whites, again, had this paternalist attitude towards blacks.
Yeah, and the problem is that most of them are from vast numbers of migrants. It's not a native, we've always been here homeland population.
That's right.
And they completely ignore the fact that there's Indians and others there as well who seem to get a pass for not being native as well.
And Jews as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, if we look at Joe Slovo and what he was up to, and how the enfranchisement of blacks, shall we call it, came about. But, you know, I can actually prove how blacks had it better under apartheid because their longevity. Now, one of the things that I was shown at one time was that there was a disparity between the longevity of blacks and the longevity of whites under apartheid. The whites lived for about 75 years, blacks for about 60. But what they didn't show was that actually before the whites took control, the blacks lived for about 40 odd years. And longevity is going down again now because it's descended into chaos and they're all killing each other and all members of gangs and so on.
And that longevity is a lot lower in countries where they run it themselves.
Yeah.
And
now,
it couldn't have been too bad if they all voluntarily migrated there at some point. I mean, you don't go to a country and say, oh, I'm going to go there and be treated horribly. Can't wait.
One of the things that an old friend of mine's cousins, his family came back from South Africa at the end of apartheid because they could see where it was going to go. And so they came back pretty much straight away. And they told me, he told me that with the taxi drivers in South Africa, they shoot bus drivers. They go around shooting bus drivers because they're taking custom away from the taxi drivers.
Bloody hell.
This is how it's descended.
They're bombing water reservoirs now in certain parts, just bombing out entire water reservoirs, but they're too dumb to realize that they've just destroyed their own water supply.
Yeah, this is the thing. And, we go on about the difference in IQ, but there is absolutely a distinct difference in IQ. And this is
even
why...
an equal IQ, you still get differences in nature. How you are.
Yes, absolutely, because there are, of course, intelligent blacks. They just don't hit the same heights of the bell curve as the whites do. They're sort of more of a rarity than among whites. And the mean is also lower. And this is why there was a white paternalist attitude towards blacks. Now, I'm personally not for it. I think that they should sort out their own civilization as befits themselves. And so I would criticize the Southerners as much as I would the Northerners during this time. Because I think that the right thing to do was, as I say, to have an organic society for white people away from blacks. But both sides played a game, if you like. The Southerners have some blame to have, even though I think that the Northerners have most of the blame. The Southerners also need to look at themselves and the lifestyle that they led, because it was bound to happen. It's happened throughout history that wherever you get empires and slaves, you get slave revolts.
Yeah, that's hardly a new lesson, is it? With Greek and Roman history and long before that even.
Yeah, that's right.
Also, the fact that the people in those ancient times also learned how to sort of control the impulses of war, because you see a lot of taboos and culture built up around things like, for instance, around Greece not burning the olive trees, but yet you see a shift from that to, and it happened at various points, to this really nasty form of war where it was just scorched earth, which is obviously something that happened quite famously in the American Civil War.
Yeah, what do you reckon to the portrayals of the war in these two films?
The most noticeable thing about both of them is obviously that they have a strong sense of the wrongness of war, as in it's a sort of futile, terrible mess, especially with what was basically brothers. And you see that in particular with Birth of a Nation, where you see the enemy army officer saving the life of somebody he thought was heroic from the other side.
That's right, and apparently this kind of thing went on.
We know that went on even in the First World War, which, you know, by that time it was mechanised and you'd think just a meat grinder, but that still went on. There was still a kind of gentlemanly aspect at times when they could.
That's right, yeah. You got as well that scene in Birth of a Nation where, because there's obviously two families that are the main families in Birth of a Nation, the Stomans and the Camerons, and they meet together. Of course, you know, the Stomans are for the north and the Camerons are for the south, and two of them meet each other, and they're both killed, aren't they? If you remember, and they both sort of lay down to die in an embrace.
That's it. Yep, it's a very touching moment as well, and it's done obviously with a lot of meaning and emotion, which it's nice to see, because what they could have turned the film into, and it would have been a lesser film for it, is a kind of rabble-rousing call for revenge. You know,
that's
it could
right,
have been
yeah.
much pettier, but instead he stepped over that and said, and looked at it bigger. The bigger picture said what a terrible waste it was, and how they had more in common than they did differences. They shouldn't do this. It shouldn't have happened, the war.
That's right, yeah. There are just one or two characters really that are treated unsympathetically. I think one of them is the elder Stoneman, the politician. Although interestingly, he gets a revisitation meted out upon him, because of course this Lynch, this half-caste that is raised up, wants to marry his daughter, and then he realizes the full horror, which is exactly like Brabantio in Othello, when he realizes that, you know, his daughter Desdemona has married Othello, and you know, and it's a revisitation upon him for what he's done, that he's raised up this non-white.
Do you think the people who, this is maybe a little off topic, but I think it's quite relevant. Obviously, the film was released in 1939. Do you think the people who made the movie knew what was going to come in the next 4 or 5 years? I don't know, like one of the main actors who plays, his name again, Leslie Howard. I believe he was killed when his plane was shot down by the Luftwaffe.
Oh right. We're Gone with the Wind now. Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry. Well, just in general, I mean, like from the films, do you think they realized what was going to happen in the following set of years after the films were made?
Well, Birth of a Nation, of course, was filmed during the First World War. America had not entered it yet, but
right, okay.
And Gone with the Wind came out during the first few months of the Second World War, and America had not entered it yet. And I think that both of these two films have this America First idea of keeping America out of a brother's war, basically. I think there is that at the back of it, even though actually the film Gone with the Wind was produced by a Jewish guy. David O. Selznick, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of their involvement in that one. So, and it's still a good film. I'll give them that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We can't say that every single Jew is bad and wicked and so
It's
on.
not
That would be nonsense.
petty-mindedness or blindness to it. No.
That's right.
If you look at the two films, then I think it's about 1 million people died in the Civil War, and that was a lot of people back then. If you balance it up to modern times, it's a lot of people that died, and the people who died in the First and Second World War just went way beyond that. And I wonder if the people who involved in the film, because it is largely an anti-war film, if they knew what was going to be coming, and if they knew how bad it was going to get. I just thought it was an interesting thing to think about when I was watching this.
Yeah. Of course, you get that scene in Gone with the Wind. I find it a really interesting scene where Scarlett goes out to find the doctor when there's the pregnancy and there's the birth of the child. And she goes out to try to find the doctor, and he's, of course, tending to the wounded. And you get that slow pan back as she's looking among the wounded, and there's just thousands upon thousands of wounded there laying in the streets as Atlanta is destroyed by the Union Army.
I wonder if they knew that was going to be happening all throughout Europe in the next few years, just cities, streets, just lined with dead people. I just thought it was really, because we can look back. I wasn't obviously born then. I didn't go and see it back in the movies way back then. So I can look back on it and think about these things. But it must have been different watching that in 1939 and watching it now, knowing what came after it.
Any of the people who remembered the feeling of a total war right on their doorstep, because that was the difference with the Civil War to the First and Second World War for America, was apart from Pearl Harbor and the paranoia from that, it was never really right on their doorstep. They'd never have to worry about the next, somebody sweeping through a town and just flattening it. That kind of horror. While the Civil War would have been much closer to the kind of experience that the Continental Wars of Europe would have been. Quite a different destruction and horror and scar on them. And I think any of the people that remembered that would realise what it would be like on the continent in Europe, certainly, with that kind of war going on.
That's right, because the American Civil War is really the first industrial war. It's often called a pre-industrial war. But you get the first machine guns in this war, and so on. That's right.
Ships
exactly.
Like
you
have called the ironclads.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. Mortars. In fact, in Birth of a Nation, you get a scene dedicated to mortar usage. Did you notice that?
Yeah, I was actually really impressed and surprised at the ambition of the battle scenes. I mean, you got to remember, this is 1915. This was released, so filmed before that. You got these really impressive, for the time, big battle scenes going on. I'm amazed that they even tried to film it. Never mind, succeeded.
Yeah. It's interesting, actually, that a lot of film directors get far more credit than D W Griffith does because, obviously, of this film. But in Alexander Nevsky, for example, that takes a hell of a lot of ideas from Birth of a Nation, particularly if you notice the heroic pose. If you look at the heroic pose of Alexander Nevsky with a sort of chest back, and the arm across and everything, that is taken absolutely from the Klansman. When he, when he dives in to save the day. So
I'm just thinking of the Iron Maiden poster here.
That's a different Klansman.
Yeah, I think
so. a very different Klansman. But yeah, I mean the Klansman, of course, this is one of the big controversies. A film in general. This film in general, and that is how the Klansmen are portrayed, because these are the heroes of the film.
And even in Gone with the Wind, much more subtle representation of them, because you never explicitly hear what they are, but they're obviously involved in some sort of militia, some sort of vigilante justice, when they're stopping bandits and things.
Yeah.
But they don't show that part of it. You just see the aftermath and the at-home side waiting for them to come back.
That's right. Yeah, there is implicit Ku Klux Klan discourse in Gone with the Wind.
And the trouble with it, of course, is if people don't like to accept. Now, obviously, there's retardation and bad things go on as well. But when you've got a situation where you strip away an old authority and justice, you end up with chaos, and then inevitably you end up with some kind of vigilantes and mob justice happening. That's just unfortunately what happens when you strip away an established system. And of course we see that in the Middle East, North Africa and so on, with the various interventionist wars. When we look at Libya, that's you've ended up with that mess when all that was turned over. It's a repeated story. So if people can accept it, obviously there's no... When you knock over the ants nest, it's not so easy just to point at one and say that's the bad and that's the good, that's total good and that's total bad. Real life doesn't work that way. Sometimes in a lawless society, you've got to come back to that, a lawless society where they can't pick up the phone and say, please help, something's happening. There sometimes is a reason for these things to happen, even if you can't endorse it or say it's... And obviously in a civilized situation, please be sensible, don't be a retard. You go through the normal channels in civilization, but there's an explanation for it. And when people try and demonize it, that situation, and therefore the film, it's because they just can't accept the reality that the situation was more complicated than school told them, or modern media.
Right. That's right. It's symptomatic of post-Christian thought, actually, in that there always has to be good and evil, and things have to be measured on absolute goods and absolute evil, whereas some things are just about survival. And certainly what we're looking at in Birth of a Nation is the Southern whites attempt to survive as a group in light of being conquered, and then not only conquered but treated as second-class citizens. And of course you have this scene where the blacks take over the politics and and the House of Representatives or whatever it is, and they have a majority, and they start to do what they like, basically, and that is to be revenged upon the whites as they see it, because of course the whites in the north have also said that you should be revenged upon them and that you were badly treated. So
which is what we're seeing hyped up to the umpteenth degree even today.
That's right. And this is the politics of the left again, in that they will build up people from the other against their fellow whites for their own political power. And this is what people like the Clintons in America are all about, and certainly increasingly in Britain, particularly Labour, but now it's gone. It's moved through the parties. The Liberal Party, of course, have been like it for many years. The Conservative Party have followed suit, and they're all now entrenched in this political idea that they have to do stuff for people who are non-white and to do stuff against whites.
It's ridiculous when you see people think these multi-millionaires and billionaires in these systems that happily order drone strikes on weddings full of kids that will happily bomb a country to the Stone Age because it suits them that day, are genuinely sitting at home weeping about poor people of any colour. These people don't give a shit about any of us. If they could enrich themselves by bombing an entire country into a sheet of glass, they would do it in a heartbeat.
That's right.
So when these people weep in the media about some alleged injustice, it's totally false. Nobody should be falling for it at this point, when their true natures should be laid bare to everybody. That's with eyes.
Yep. Yeah, you've got it in one. They're only interested in their own personal political power. And this is the problem you have when you have that individualistic society. And this is really symptomatic of the North, of what the North embodies in this film, particularly Birth of a Nation, where you have that character of Stoneman, this senator, this extremely powerful senator. You have quite a sympathetic portrayal of Abraham Lincoln, actually. I noticed that. Yeah. But that shows that the filmmaker is not making propaganda here. That he is actually trying to make something that resembles real life. And again, you have the fact that not all black characters are villainous. You have the Mammy character, of course, who jumps on those two blacks for the white family to get away, because she's rather burly kind of person. So she, and it's it's a bit of comedy, but at the same time it portrays her as being very sympathetic. So things are not just black and white, shall we say?
Yeah, they show good characteristics and honor and all sorts.
That's right. In Gone with the Wind, I think that has been covered up a lot, though. The the things that blacks did in the South once they'd got license to do so, that has been completely erased, it would appear.
You could almost say that they marginalised even the existence of them. There was a few sympathetic characters that I suppose you had to have and were key characters, and that was about it.
Yeah, you don't really have a bad black character, though, do you?
No. But you also don't see the sort of masses of them that you do in Birth of a Nation. You get an idea, a lot more of the numbers of them that would have been about back then. That he's trying to show it as it was. There was a mass of them. Well, in Gone with the Wind, you almost feel like there's just a handful in the whole South.
I don't know. You do see certain scenes where they're congregating outside, like the saloon. There's like a big group of them, and they're all hanging about and chatting, which is what they, dare I say, that's kind of what they do these days. But and remember, there's a scene where the white woman's got to walk in between them, and they're all kind of looking at her.
Or the bit where they march off. That's right, to dig for the country. Yeah, right enough. There was a few bits. Although the film Gone with the Wind was nowhere near as stark and brutal as the first one, not just in the sense of violence, but I mean in its portrayal of kind of human nature and things that come from it. It was a much softer, more romantic film.
It's very true, yeah. Yeah, that's very true. Very much sanitized version of the American Civil War in certain respects, I think.
And even though I'm convinced it was almost like a remake, even the way it concentrated initially on the family, the boys going off to war, the girls with the romantic dreams, there was such a strong sort of mirror of the story in parts that it's hard to imagine it wasn't heavily inspired by.
Yeah, very, very much so. One thing I think that was problematic in Birth of a Nation was the white characters playing blacks, not really because they were playing blacks, but really because the makeup was so badly done. And I couldn't believe that in a film of this epic scope and so on, that the makeup was so badly done. They'd even forgot to black up on their chests and arms and so on. It was so badly done.
It was black and white minstrels convention, wasn't it? It was like It was worse than that.
It's true, yeah.
Oddly enough, I mean, they surely could have got either better makeup or a few blacks in the right roles.
Yeah, absolutely right. One thing that was pretty brutal, I think, was the portrayal of the attempted rape of the Cameron sister by Gus, the black guy, and of course she leaps to her death to avoid that. This kind of thing apparently went on. There's a philosopher, what can we call her? A writer who was part of the civil rights movement and so on, who was writing at the time of Birth of the Nation and so on, called Ida B. Wells. And she said that basically this kind of thing didn't go on. She tried to whitewash it, shall we say, or blackwash it out of history. But we can see that it goes on, because it's happening pretty much every day now. So I think that her work needs to be looked at again, to be quite honest. She said there was basically that it was every white woman's dream to want to be with a black guy. Basically is how she explained it. But this is obviously not true because of the prevalence for rape. It goes on to a far higher degree than the reverse.
Yeah, it's shocking when you look at it in America, especially because they've got very good crime statistics. And
Um,
it's completely out of balance as well for numbers.
I wonder if there's like mass rapes of black women in Africa from white men. I wonder if that's like an epidemic now in any African country.
Well,
I think you would have heard about it somehow.
Yeah, I think. I mean,
exactly.
you would have thought. I mean, a leftist would have latched onto this and found all this information, or at least even they haven't discovered it.
Well, that's when I get suspicious when they talk about the number of hate crimes. I think, well, if I'm hearing about some on the news, mainstream news, I hear about somebody saying something rude about Twitter, and that's a terrible hate crime they're all having fits about. And I think, well, if that's what they're picking out as the worst thing to show off, then it can't be that bad. You know, there aren't lynch mobs running about, there aren't rape gangs doing stuff, because I would hear about it. The news would go, oh, that proves our point, how terrible these people are, and they would trumpet it from every hill. You'd never hear the end of it.
Mm.
And in an odd way, they've proven themselves wrong by what they choose to advertise.
Absolutely, yeah. That's very true. That the left don't really have a clue about real life in a way. This is why they need theory.
Mm. It's also why when they're looking for an opinion, they've got to keep retreating to their hug box, basically, this comfort zone that'll tell them what to think and what to believe. They don't say, well, I'm going to dig about. It's also why they end up the ones that's advocating for censorship the most, because they daren't listen to anything contradictory because it'll upset them. You know, they'll have an emotional reaction towards this other idea or contradictory facts and just react emotionally. And that's all they have, because their whole world's based on emotion, their view and theory and ideas in their head rather than reality. So for them, there's nothing more powerful and bigger a wound than an opposing idea, because that's everything to them. Well, to us, it's not such a big idea. You can entertain the thought in your own head even, and it doesn't bother you, even if you reject it.
Well, this is one of the big ideas of post-structuralism, in that emotion is reason. This is why they're absolutely barking mad. This is why, you have that sort of barking mad reaction and we can't understand it. It's because of this idea that emotion itself is reason. It's
used
insane.
To be considered. Yeah, I was just going to say that used to be a pretty reasonable definition of insanity. You'd lost adult human logic and control and resorted to just this emotional beast.
Yeah. That's right. I think that certainly the American Civil War is, one of the main factors for leading us down this way towards the left. I'm going to come on to some of the characters, especially in Gone with the Wind, where I think that you have more developed characters. Now, it's important to remember, of course, that Birth of a Nation, for its time, had very developed characters, but in Gone with the Wind, obviously with being a talkie as well, you can have much more character development. I think that just as Birth of a Nation was revolutionary at its time, this huge color epic is also immense undertaking for its time. Again, I think that what we have is some characters are quite flat. I think that Ashley Wilkes is a bit of a flat character, whereas Rhett Butler is far more rounded and far deeper and so on. I don't know what you made of that, this contrast between the two characters. You have sort of a cool character and a hot character, as they call it.
Ashley's character, he's much more sensible. He's the kind of guy that you would probably want to be by your side. I think Rhett Butler's a bit of a show-off. He's a bit of a game talker. But he acts like he's this cool, tough kind of guy. But is he really?
Well, it's interesting, actually. He actually plays things down quite a bit. Don't forget that near the beginning, he refuses a duel. And it's not because he's frightened of the duel. As Ashley Wilkes says, he's one of the best shots in the country. And he's basically saved this young's life by refusing it. So he's more complex than that. And again, he goes and fights for the Confederate Army when he knows they're losing, purely because he's ashamed that he's not fought for them.
And they do give him quite a complex relationship with Scarlett, where you see the very frustrating to the viewer failure of the relationship at parts, because They just won't bloody sit down and talk properly.
That's right. Well, of course.
He keeps hiding things and she hides things, and there's a complication. You think if they just sat down and talk openly, you want to reach. It's one of these films where you want to reach in and sit the two people down to get them just to talk properly and sort it all out. Of course, I would ruin the script in the process.
You have quite a controversial scene as well, which is the marital rape.
That's right. Yeah.
And this is quite a big thing. I'm surprised actually that feminists haven't tried to ban this film.
Yeah, true. For them, there's more to object to in this film, in that sense.
Yeah, but he's still not demonized by the film, by this act, which is interesting. He still doesn't become this demonic figure or anything like that, because it treats everybody as human and as having motivations that are, we may understand them, we may not, but we at least see that they're motivations that are rounded and have a certain logic to them. And this is the thing now in the present age. We can't make films like this anymore.
No.
You become a black and white villain or good guy, and that's about it. You've got to be a Christ-like figure or the devil.
Exactly. And it's interesting that these people who purport not to believe in Christianity anymore have created what is basically a replacement for it with the same kind of morality.
Well, you see that, especially in social media now. Somebody slips up and even just says something or makes some minor mistake. They get hounded on social media as if they're Satan himself. And they're forced to apologise and get humiliated and apologise and perform, and they never get forgiven because they've got this idea that if you're not this perfect person, then you're the devil. That's it.
Yeah. One thing I found as interesting as well was the direction in the film, especially the use of colour. Because, of course, this is quite an early colour film, 1939. They make full use of colour, especially with the characters, especially Scarlet, who's often dressed in green. Did you notice that? Scarlet in green.
Yeah.
And there's this idea, of course, the redness, because she has sort of reddish hair, doesn't she? And that's the fiery sort of character, and also the Celtic aspect of her. But equally, the green is to foreground her Irishness, and also to foreground her connection with the land, I think, as well.
Yeah.
And also her jealousy, because green, of course, is a colour of envy. All the way through, she's envious of the relationship between Ashley and his wife, Melanie. So I thought that was interesting. I also thought what was interesting was the use of silhouettes. Did you notice that as well? Lots of shots of the evening, the sun going down, the sunset and everything. Because we're looking at the sunset on a way of life as well, and Ashley mentions that in the film, doesn't he? That it's the end of a way of life, the end of a civilization. It's not just hinted at; it's made quite explicit the sort of themes of the film in this. Yeah, and of course you get that as well with the child that Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara have, and she's named Bonnie Blue. Of course, the Bonnie Blue is the flag of the South, and she dies, of course, in infancy. In the same way, of course, Scarlett O'Hara's father also dies. Yeah. So you have a foreshadowing there and a repetition.
They died in a sort of foolhardy charge. And in the same way, the people are shown at the start in a sort of foolhardy charge towards war.
Remember, the kid dies in a foolhardy on her pony, remember? Yeah, and she races off and tries to do...
because it's a kid. Yeah. You go, it's actually quite horrible to watch.
And also, when Scarlett falls down the stair, that rash bit of... She flinches and she wrenches her arm away and she falls down. Everything seems to be a mistake, or it should never have happened that way. People should never have lost their temper or just gone off and done something willy-nilly and injured or killed themselves over it. It just seems to be a film full of tragedy and people just making mistakes that they've made purely out of emotion, really.
Impulse.
Yeah.
But that's quite good, because in real life, of course, that's what does happen. People have some daft impulse and you end up in one of these Darwin Awards or somebody's unfortunate funny video where you trying to leap off a roof into a swimming bath and landing head first in the lawn, that kind of thing.
Yeah, especially, I mean, when you have a character like Scarlet and a character like Rhett, and they expect their child to be any less, what would be the word, reckless.
Well, that recklessness did drive a lot of the film, but also her will. I mean, it had its bad side, but also had its good side. They showed where she had a strong will, could play up and cause havoc, but also could pull things back together and direct other people.
It's interesting that at the end of both parts, you have that foregrounding of the will, and hope for the future. At the end of the first part, of course, you have this idea that the Southern way of life, which is based on honor, aristocratic values, honesty, and so on, the heroic ideal and everything, that's gone. And, she has this monologue where she says that she will lie and cheat and steal and murder to make it a Northern Union-dominated society.
Never go hungry again.
That's right, never go hungry again. And then at the end of the second part, she again said, but she's learnt from that. She's learnt from the mistakes of the first part, it seems. And it certainly gives the hope for the future. Tomorrow is another day, as she says at the end, which is the final words of the film.
And even the fact that she would say something like that shows a great maturation from the start of her character.
Yeah.
There was no tantrum, there was no why me, it was just, tomorrow's another day.
That's right. I think that it's a wonderful thing for the film to end upon, perhaps even for this podcast to end upon, because, of course, we're seeing the way of life that we once had disappear, but, of course, tomorrow's another day, and we can dust ourselves off, and we can make things right. We can learn from the mistakes that we've made, and get on with things. But of course, it's all about perseverance, and this is one of the big lessons that you have in this film. This idea of perseverance, and that life goes on, and that we have to have a bit of will and a bit of strength and a bit of gumption.
To endure.
That's right.
No matter what goes wrong, if you can endure it, you've a chance of doing something better in the future.
Yep,
well, you don't get anything for just giving up.
Yeah. So if there's nothing more to add, gentlemen.
Just that I'm shocked that this film is Gone with the Wind, especially, is not in the top 100 on IMDb, while a Spider-Man kids cartoon is. Absolutely shocking. Who is rating these films? Get a grip. Imagine if there was a time capsule with the top 100 films, and you're missing out on what anybody would sensibly agree is a cinematic classic. Something has gone wrong, people.
I spent most of my life not watching this movie, and the only thing I ever really had seen of it was 4 seconds where Clark Gable says, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." I'd always known that was from the movie. So when I watched it, it really did feel like 4 hours of my life had been magically added into, like this missing jigsaw piece that was 4 hours long had been magically filled in with something, because I wanted to know what the rest of the film was like, and I just assumed it was just a cheesy melodrama, and that's why I never had any real ambition to watch it. And when I did, I realized, I'm kind of glad I waited my entire life to watch this, because if I watched this when I was younger, I don't think I would have had the appreciation that I do now.
Yeah.
And it really is a fantastic film, and part of me is a little bit ashamed. I regard myself as a movie buff, but I've never seen this film up until a couple of weeks ago. So I would say to anyone, if you're like me, maybe wait a while. Maybe give it a chance and sit down when you really want to see it. And it will open your mind on many things.
Yeah. It's a film that definitely is best appreciated with an adult mind and a bit of experience, because then things will tug at you emotionally and you'll understand things a bit broader than you might have done as a teenager. Not to put down, obviously, anybody who's a teenager now, and everybody has different life experience, but there is, while broadening your experiences, you do start to appreciate certain things in a different way, or a bit more, that you might have not fully taken in or understood at the time, just because of that lack of common ground.
Yeah. Absolutely right. So, gentlemen, then I think we'll close things here, unless there's anything you want to add. No? Yes?
No.
Oh, good.
Definitely
No,
worth a watch.
I didn't hum
Absolutely.
I didn't hum the theme tune on the way in. Shall we all hum it on the way out?
You two can.
After a quick tomorrow is another day. No one's joining in.
Come on, James. Get involved.
I was thinking, how's this going to sound with a slight lag we've got to have?
Right. Well, anyway, goodbye. Please subscribe, and we hope to see you next time.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Comments and suggestions below.
As always.